Hi-ho, hi-ho, it's off to war we go, with a rifle and a spade and a bayonet blade. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. Now then, hi everyone, going off to war, going off to fight in World War I. Well, of course, you would need a rifle, a 303, the Enfield 303. Yes, bayonets were attached to the rifle. You need weapons to go and fight in a war. But why, ladies and gentlemen? Why would you take a spade? Why were millions of spades taken to the Western Front? Of course, as we know, the answer was the trench. Why did they dig trenches? Have you got any idea? It seems unusual. Why would they do that? Now, before we get to that, one of my favourite bands of all time, classic band from the 1970s and 1980s, The Jam. And here we have an album of their greatest hits. They had many, ladies and gentlemen, and possibly the greatest, one of their best ever songs, Going Underground. And that's what millions of men did on the Western Front. They almost lived underground because they dug the trenches. And this video will have a look at why that was. Now, first thing we have to consider, advances, new weapons, new technology. In the 19th century, in the 1800s and before then, most of the battles were pitched battles fought in open fields. Now, that was no longer the case because of these new weapons, because of the machine gun, because of the new types of artillery and the bombs that were exploding. In the old days, battlefields were very, very smoky because all the explosions gave off smoke. But as technology improved and we moved to smokeless explosions, there wasn't the smoke. So therefore, you could see all parts of the battlefield. Now, the French army at the Battle of the Marne, they weren't really aware of this. They still had their old style uniforms, bright red trousers, very, very bright blue jackets. Now, when the, oops, wrong way round. That's better. When the Germans approached at the Battle of the Marne, they inflicted huge casualties, over 25,000 on one day, in the French army, because of these really bright uniforms. The Germans, with their new weapons, could see them very clearly. So the Battle of the Marne showed that they're going to have to come up with an idea. The Germans had sort of greyer uniforms, but for the French in their bright uniforms, it was a disaster. Now, if you are up on top of the ground and you're in very clear view and your men are being killed by the thousand, what would be the only answer? Get some protection. In other words, start digging a trench. And as we move through 1914, both sides, the French and the British and Belgium on one side, the Germans on the other, they tried to outflank each other. They tried to get round the back of the other army. But as they moved, so that army moved, and so on and so on. And in the end, it became known as the Race to the Sea, as the soldiers moved to try and outflank. And as they are trying to outflank, racing to the sea, the English Channel, the North Sea, they start to dig the trenches. And that is why we get the trenches. Now, once, of course, trenches were dug, remember in one of my other videos I said, oh, great news, we'll go and fight in World War I. Let's go quickly because it's all going to be over by Christmas. Well, not if you've dug a trench. Because once the trench is there, you can't go backwards because you don't want to give up the land. If you go forwards, you might meet the machine gun fire of the enemy. So both sides tended to be stuck. Not defeated, just stuck in the trenches. And that's why the war was not over by Christmas, because we had reached what we call a stalemate. You cannot push forward, you don't want to go backwards, so you were stuck. Stalemate. The only thing that happened in that first Christmas, instead of no war, the war's over forever. Can you see it there? Silent Night. 1914, the remarkable Christmas truce. The men in the trenches themselves, the Germans actually started it on Christmas Eve. They got out of their trench, and for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, there was no fighting. Both sides got out of their trench, moved on to no man's land, exchanged buttons, cigarettes, drinks, played a few games of football, and then went back to the war. That was the only thing that happened on Christmas, not the end of the war, just a temporary 3-day break from the fighting. Christmas truce. So, we have the trenches. Now, here's one of my favourite books, The Trench. It's all about the soldiers from Hull and the East Yorkshire regiments. Now, although it's a useful book, it's got a bad name, The Trench, because you've got to get into your heads, ladies and gentlemen. It wasn't just one trench. In fact, there were over 10,000 trenches. Now, the British soldiers, remember I said that they used to come up with funny names for places like Ypres. They called it Wipers. Well, with their sense of humour, they gave names to the trenches. Here's just a few for you. Some you might be able to see how they got their name. The first two. One was called Rat Alley. That's not going to be a nice place to live. The other was called Death Valley. Not a nice place either. Here's a couple. Maybe they were passing comments on their generals. Who knows? One was called Idiot Street. And another was called Hopeless Street. And the final two, very strange. I don't know how they got the names for these. Hiccup Trench and Nonsense Trench. They're just 6 names. But there were thousands of trenches. Now, at first, obviously, it was one simple line for protection. But then it became later far more complicated than that. You get, first of all, your front line. Then, of course, you get communication trenches. So if that's your front line, communication trenches are running backwards this way, all the way back. And then behind your front line, you get your support trench to support the people at the front line along the communication, maybe 50, 60, 100 metres behind the front line. And then further back, maybe about another 300 metres or so about 400 metres altogether, you get your reserve trench. So it's a complicated network of trenches. And you've got kitchens, toilets, hospitals, all in this network. And we'll do more particularly about the hospitals in the next video or two. Now, what was the trench like? Well, I'm sure your teacher will show you a cross-section or a picture of a trench. Basically, there's the front, there's the actual trench with a little fire step there, and there's the back. Okay, at the front you've got sandbags to protect against bullets and also blasts. This front bit was called the parapet. This was at an angle called a revetment. Then you had your fire step. Your soldier would stand on that to fire over the top. Then you'd have the bottom of the trench, and then at the back there, leading up to more, a mound of soil there to protect against blast, and that's the parados at the back. Have a look. I'm sure you can get a picture, and then you can see the key features of the trench. Now, remember what I said in one of my other videos? The differences. Don't make generalizations. The soldiers didn't go to war and spend 4 years in a trench. No, it was not like that. They would break the time up, so maybe 10 to 15% is in the front line, the real dangerous part of the trench. Maybe 10% is in the support trench. Maybe 30% is in the reserve trench. And then maybe 40%, 45%, they're actually away from the trenches altogether, having a bit of a rest and relaxation, having a few drinks. So remember what I said, it's not all one particular answer. There's different things going on in the trenches. But the key word for us, though, is problems. The trenches, yes, they were good because it gave some protection to the men. Think of the Battle of the Marne, without protection, terrible casualties. But the trenches provided problems that the soldiers had to try and overcome. Key features of the trench and their problems. Well, here's a few. Bringing enough communication and supplies up. Now, they used horses, and many horses sadly were killed in World War I. But what happens when it all gets churned up and it turns to mud? Again, there are very famous photographs of horses sinking down into the mud. Later, railways were used. So communication and supplies is one big problem. Here's another big problem. What about moving all the wounded away from the front line? Well, for a start off, you've got to actually collect the soldiers from where they did get wounded. Sometimes that would be out in no man's land, and you'd have to wait for night time to go and get them, or the soldiers can come back themselves. There was often, because of the shells, craters, big holes. They often got filled full of water. Not very nice places and not very hygienic either. So it's causing problems. So moving the wounded, and when you get them into the trench system, remember what I said about the network? Well, it's busy and it's very slow, and people are bumping into each other, and some of the trenches are still being bombed. So it was often overcrowded. If you're trying to get men wounded back from the front line at the same time as people are trying to bring supplies or heavy equipment to the front line, there's a problem there. It's overcrowding. Some of the trenches had twists and turns. So it's more difficult to move people. Now, remember, if you're in the trench, unless a bomb lands exactly into your trench, you are reasonably safe. Remember the thing I said about stalemate? Well, the British and the French had lost a lot of land at the start of the war, and they had to try and get it back. So for them, their tactic, there it is, over the top. They all went over the top of the trench, often at the same time. Think about the Battle of the Somme, 7 o'clock on July the 1st. Thousands of men go over the top of the trench together. Because they're all going over the top together, they're all getting wounded together. So there's another problem. You've got a huge number of wounded all at the same time, and you've got to get them back. And remember what I said, it's overcrowded. 40,000 were wounded on the Somme on day one. So how are you going to move all of those, particularly if it is muddy? Final point. Don't forget, there were differences in terrain, in the land, the ground. Some of the area in Flanders was very muddy, particularly around Passchendaele, Ypres. And when the shells, millions of shells exploded, it churned it all up. The water table rose to the surface, and in bad weather, it became very muddy, more difficult to move the wounded. At the same time, though, remember Arras. In Arras, it was more chalk-based, so therefore there isn't that problem. And if you remember, they were able to dig underneath and they even put a hospital, 200 beds, in Arras. So it's more different, if you remember. However, problems with the trenches remained, particularly for moving the wounded. There's something called the golden hour. If you can treat somebody within 60 minutes of the wound or their injury, they have a better chance of survival. But if they're stuck in no man's land or they're right in the front line trench and you've got to move them miles and miles back to a hospital, you're not going to treat them in the 60 minutes. So therefore, the British Army had to come up with a better system. They had to be able to deal with and treat their wounded soldiers more quickly. Delay was bad. and they wanted to get the soldiers fit to go back and fight. So it was a significant problem for them. Delay was terrible. How could they solve that problem? Well, they did solve it to some extent, and I'll tell you about it in the next video. But until then, what I intend to do is a bit more marching. I hope, it's off to war we go, and there's the spade. Because, as I said at the start, sadly, they were all going underground. Hope it's been useful. Speak to you soon with the next video. All the best now. See you later.